Studies in the book of Deuteronomy. I don't know how many of you have studied the book of Deuteronomy before, let alone read it. I have never studied it in depth before. I never have, for one reason or another. And the book of Deuteronomy is a book that is oftentimes neglected by Christians. Why? Why would that be? Why would we neglect that, if you would accept that word, but can't find it in the
I
Bible?
didn't say a word.
No.
It's on the left side.
I found it.
Anyway, why do we not? Why do we not?
Second giving of the law, a lot of people
Yeah.
don't care much.
You know, I certainly agree that there are many reasons why we don't, I think, in general. It's part of the Old Testament. There are many people that don't want to spend any time reading in the Old Testament. That we're New Testament Christians, why should we bother with the Old Testament? It's part of the covenant law given to national Israel by God through Moses. It's a long book, as you will learn. It's 34 chapters.
We're gonna be here for 3 years.
3 years? You sit over here with Bill. I'm not gonna watch you both at one time. So it's extensive passages of rules and regulations directed to the people of Israel back, 1400 BC or so. And yet I think if we'll focus and be intent, that we're going to find that this is a book that Christians can learn a great deal from. The name Deuteronomy derives from the Greek rendering of a phrase in chapter 17, verse 8, a misquoted verse oftentimes, but where the king, who is to rule over Israel, is commanded in that verse to prepare a copy of the law. So it is, as Bobby just said, the second giving of the law of God to Israel. The first giving, you'll remember, I think, you'll remember that the first giving of the law was on Mount Horeb, on Mount Sinai. The second book, this second book, was a repetition of the first, and this time it was delivered on the plains of Moab, as the nation of Israel was traversing all through the wilderness. And what you and I are going to find, I think, if we'll pay it, Wilma, get me a little bit of coffee, would you please? I seem to be tightening up in the throat for some reason. It's like when Wilma has her hands around my throat. You wake up like that, it scares you.
Wait till she cuts back her out.
I know, she has more strength. I'm worried about it. And so we're going to find in this book, I think, as we study it, it's not so much about the dispensation of the law and commandments, as it is, I think, an exposition on an exposition of the practical faith that God longs to see evidenced in the lives of His people then and now. Thank you, baby. Now.
Will somebody taste it first?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Well, at this age, it doesn't matter.
That's why you got to lose.
Hey, go for it. You know, might as well go out kicking and screaming. I want us to take a bit of time in introduction and setting the stage for our study. I've told you before, one of the joys that I have, particularly when you're 82, is that I want to, when I study, I want to put myself into that locale, into that situation as best I can understand it, and make it personal for me. When we're talking about Moses, when I study, I want to be alongside Moses with Joshua. I want to help you get the most out of it, rather than leaving it abstract. And one of the lessons that God wants us to learn from even these Old Testament, these quote dried, withered old books of the Old Testament, And so I want to take some time as we set the stage, because I want you to personalize it. I really do. I want you to walk where they walk and to eat what they eat and to experience to a degree what they experienced as they're depicted to us in the Word of God. And so, you know, most of you know the major events that we'll be looking at, particularly in the first part of Deuteronomy. You know, you've learned those in Sunday school or certainly heard them preached. But I want us to transform ourselves, if we can, into the stories to better see what God has and what God is trying to tell the people then and we now. So, that being said, I need to confess that I happen to be one of those fussy sorts of people that believes that life is most pleasant. It's most pleasant when everything that should happen happens when it should happen. Anybody like me? You know, it should happen. And the emphasis on the way. How about you? You like that when everything goes well, when it's supposed to go well?
Who doesn't?
Yeah. You know, like, for example, when the Christmas presents you ordered on the internet arrive on time. You know, that's always a joy when that happens. When your automobile is ready, when you go out and when the repair shop says it's going to be ready. When the doctor lets you into his office right on time.
Dream on.
That happened once. When the dish you're preparing at night for the family dinner is ready, actually right at dinner time. When the crew at your work site is all ready and on time. And you know, when one of my favorite movies as our grandkids were growing up was the Home Alone series. Have y'all ever watched those? I haven't watched them lately, but I've watched a few. Lord, they're on there every night, so you can see them. But everything little Kevin planned to happen to the bandits happened perfectly. Little rascal. You know, yeah, it's a great thing when things happen as they're supposed to happen. Now, on the other hand, life can be most unpleasant when things go haywire, right? You know, and things just don't go according to your plan. I don't know if many of you know my full background, but I've been a planner by trade, I guess you'd call it that. Some would say an imbecile by trade, but anyway, a planner by trade. And so I like things to go according to plan. I am such a fanatic, and Freud had a better name for that. But anyway, I believe planning, when there's chaos, it's evidence of the absence of planning. You follow what I'm saying? So if one plans well, that there are less chaos. Yeah, that's it. Have a plan. So when things don't go according to plan, and it just takes, you know, like when you're trying to get out the door to go to church when your 1-year-old ends up having to change her clothes 3 times because she barked or something, you know, on her clothes. You know what that's like?
I'm probably the only one here who watched the 18, but that guy used to say at the end of it how great it was when the plan comes together.
Mm-hmm. Our second son, Michael, who had now we find out a very marvelous but scary career in the CIA, and he was a little tyke. I used to call him Dirtball, which that's so enormous stopped me. He said it would warp his psyche, so I stopped at that time. But Mike, we'd get ready. We had 5 kids, and getting 5 kids ready to go out the door at any one time is just wild. But Mike was the second child. We'd get Rick, the oldest, all dressed and ready to go out, and he would sit there and be just deep kid. Hated it. But the second kid, Mike, you would dress him, sit him on the couch, you turn your back, and he was filthy. I don't know how he did that. I don't know where he found all that dirt. He was just filthy, so we'd have to start over again and get him going. So, when you got 15 minutes to get to work and your car won't start. And not too long ago, I had one of those great experiences where things didn't happen on time or the way I wanted it. In fact, it was the week before we went off to Florida last year. We were out on visitation down here in Sunny Ridge or whatever this Sunny Set or something. off of,
Sunny Mead?
Sunset?
Sunny Lane?
No, you're coming out from Alice.
Oh, okay.
Anyway, Norm and I were visiting, and it was snow all over the ground, and we drove up in what we thought was the driveway. That gives you a hint. And went in and said hello to the people who were glad to see us come in, trudging through the snow and tearing up their yard. And the car got stuck in there. And then, you know what? I lost my keys. So we didn't have any keys. We couldn't get the car started. And finally, I went out and we got another set of keys at home and came back and just tore this poor sucker's yard up. He doesn't come to this church anymore. It had nothing to do with this, for all I know. And so, it just, yeah, babe.
You want to tell them about our first time ever unique experience on visiting this week for the new neighbors down on Country Lane or wherever we were in the middle of the
You
woods?
can tell them.
No, you tell them.
We went out to visit somebody way out in the woods somewhere, off a country road down past your place. And we knocked on the front door with no answer, but we heard animals in the backyard. So we started to walk around the side of the house. And here's this guy out in the midst of all these animals, buck naked. Oh, backyard. And no one wanted to go on and talk to him. So we hurriedly did the back thing, and got out of there as quick as we could. So anyway, my point is, we all know what it's like, that some things, just seem to take this long to do and to get, some take this long and this long and this long to do. And all of this is backdrop for what's happening to the nation of Israel as we begin looking into Deuteronomy. Now, let's suppose you and your family were planning on taking a 10 to 12 day cross-country trip, okay? And but what would it be like if that 10 to 12 day road trip you had planned ended up lasting, say, 6 months? You're already planning for a 10 to 12 day. But what would happen to you if that trip that you had planned to be less than 2 weeks ended up lasting a year? Or 5 years, let's say. Let's say that Noel and Joan Austin, they drive out of their driveway tomorrow morning headed for the promised land of Michigan. Okay? And for some unforeseen reasons, you guys did not get there until the year 2022. 5 years. Let's suppose that your trip didn't take 5 years at all, it took 40 years. 40 years. You start out on your trip. I don't know how old you are, Noel, but let's say you're 39. And Joan, you're 27 as you start on this trip. And you left this week, Noel, and you did not get to your place in Michigan until you were 79 years old. Think about it. I mean, really, think about it. The next trip you take, you're going to go to your place, wherever that is, and it's going to be a 3, 4, 5, 7 day trip. And all of a sudden, it takes 40 years.
Oh, really?
40 years. And, I believe that if something like that happened to Noel and Joan, they would handle it well. But the rest of us, I don't know. Now think about this. I mean, if that happened to any one of us over the course of that journey, we would have gone through seemingly endless cycles of frustration and anger and resignation and then maybe hope that you're going to get there, and then frustration again. Can you feel it? Noah's not a good car traveler. She either has to be driving or sleeping. And if I insist on driving both times, she'll get in the car, slam the door, throw her head back, and open her mouth, and she's gone. Down the next 1,000 miles. Down the road. I won't last a day. I won't last. And that cycle goes on and on and on for year after year. And through it all, I think, the question that would not go away would be, what in the world is happening, and why is it happening to me? Why is it happening to me? Ever asked that? Yeah? I think I have. You know, why can't I get to the place I'm supposed to be? And you say, this is a nightmare. And you'd say that especially if you were a contemporary and a traveling companion of a man named Moses. Now you see, in about 1440 BC, before Christ, a 120-year-old guy named Moses stood up in front of maybe close to 2 million Israelites and followers in a desert wilderness that looked pretty much like that. Doesn't that look like an inviting place to be? This is a picture of our son on his last Israeli trip in the desert where they were. And notice Moses gets up and he announces, people, we're finally here. We're finally here. I believe congratulations are in order. We've finally completed the trip, and just to remind you that we did it in almost 40 years, and it should have taken us 11 days. Congratulations. So, let me invite you to turn in your Bible to Deuteronomy chapter 1. If you're not there, follow in your word, please. I don't know what or how you think, but perhaps this morning you're thinking, I mean, really, I want to elaborate on this a little bit. Why are we, the New Testament Church of Jesus Christ, taking the time to study the Old Testament book of Deuteronomy? And if you're thinking that way, it's okay, by the way, because that's a question I think you ought to ask whenever you open the Bible. Honestly, why any of it? Why should we study any of this? And anytime you approach the Bible, any passage, you should ask, I think, and find the answer to, why this book? Why this passage? You know, what does God have to say to me here? If we believe what we're told, that this is a love letter from a loving Father, then He has something to say to us in that letter. And so what is it? It seems to me sometimes it jumps out at you. Other times you have to think a little bit to see. Now, Deuteronomy is much more than the most often quoted book that Jesus quoted from during His earthly life. Did you know that? Jesus, in the New Testament, quoted the most from Deuteronomy, from any of the other Old Testament books. Ryrie, who's a great Bible writer and commentator, tells us that of the 27 books in the New Testament, right? 27 books in the New Testament? Yes, did. 27. Right. 27. And of the 27, 17 of those 27 quote from Deuteronomy. It's an important book. If 17 of our writers are 17 instances where it's quoted. You know, it's more than the name implies. Deutero, meaning the second time, and onomy, the law, the second giving of the law, and it's more than a recapitulation of the stuff that you can already find, by the way, if you've done any reading in the Old Testament. You'll find in the last part of the book of Exodus, the book of Leviticus, and the first part of Numbers. So you'll see cross-references as you go. And it is more than a summary of the final addresses or sermons of one of the greatest leaders to ever walk the face of the earth, and that's Moses. More than all of these things, this is a book about the lessons this is about the lessons that God's people needed to remember while they were on their way and whenever they got stuck or sidetracked or off-centered in waylaid. Lessons having to do with why it took so very, very long to travel 225 miles. 40 years to cover 225 miles. 225. To give you a little perspective of that, it's 180 miles to DC. Okay? Just for example, it's 217 to Baltimore. It's 226 to Charleston, West Virginia. It's 205 miles to Charlotte. 40 years. You ever planned a road trip like that? Norm and I go to up to DC, often Northern Virginia, often. You know, it's about a 3.5 hour drive. Casually, I don't drive like Bobby. I keep the speed limit. And so you know, Bobby does it in 2 hours.
On a bicycle.
What I'd like to do this morning, in the time that we have as we introduce this great study, is to give you a little bit overview of this chapter and then get into some of the details a bit. And I doubt that we'll get close. There's several lessons that I want us to bring out of that in addition to just the knowledge of what the Word of God is saying. So an overview of the chapter looks like these. We have in verses 1 through 5, we have the introduction to the entire book. It declares that the intent of Moses in verse 3. In verse 3 it says, in the 40th year, on the first day of the 11th month, Moses proclaimed to the Israelites all that the Lord had commanded him concerning them. So this is Moses' last set of speeches to these people. He'd said a lot of things to them, I'm sure, over the course of nearly 40 years of going through, and this is to be his last series of sermons. And if you want a nutshell of Deuteronomy, it's basically this: Moses' last sermon about why the people of Israel got stuck and what they should do about it. I'm going to ask you somewhere along the line, and I'll give you just a preview of that. And that is, I'm going to ask you, have you ever been in any desert situations, any wilderness situations? I'm not talking about the desert here necessarily, but dry times. Dry times in your life, dry times in your spiritual life, your work life, your family life. We'll talk about that a little more. You see, what happened here, you can see on the map, as they went up there at the top and they came across and came down through the land of Goshen, came out and came down to down at the bottom here is Mount Sinai, and it's called both Mount Sinai and Mount Horeb. And there the first giving of the law happened, when the law was given. Moses went up on the mountain, remember? And he came down with these humongous stones, the 10 Commandments. He probably wanted the Reader Digest version, I think, but he came down carrying the stones. And so they crossed the Bitter Lakes, or the Red Sea, or sometimes called the Reed, C-R-E-E-D-C, and were led by Moses. Now, I have a little confession to make to you. I'm going to disclose something to you that I have not done with anyone for about 19 years. When Norm and I were in Israel about 18, 19 years ago, we had a very enterprising, very clever guide, and he was willing to sell me an invaluable picture of Moses. That there are very few in existence, and he wanted $10,000 for it, if you can imagine. But being the clever negotiator that I am, I got him down to $100 for this. And so I gave him $100 and we snuck that picture off, and so now I show it to him.
You hope.
There's
Looks a lot like Charlton Heston, doesn't it?
Yeah.
it's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, the resemblance.
I don't know about you all, but I have fun. So after they crossed the Red Sea, then they traveled down to Mount Sinai there. And there at Mount Sinai, as I said, God gave to Moses and the people the first rendition of the law, their laws, their constitution, and the Ten Commandments there. And after receiving the covenant from God and their laws and agreeing at that time to do it, to obey it, to follow it, they traveled up north along the Gulf of Aqaba, as you can see. We were going up the Gulf of Aqaba, and and they got up there. And then in a few days later, they reached the region of Kadesh Barnea. See Kadesh Barnea? Here at the arrow, which was sort of the entrance to the promised land. If they just go a little more northeast into the promised land. Now, it was only about 11-day journey from Mount Sinai to Kadesh. About 11 days. They're all walking, by the way. They didn't have any cars or railways or anything like that. And so they were walking. So, they're going about this 225 miles, give or take a little bit. Now something that happened here, and we'll talk about that in a minute. I think most of you know it, but we'll go and explore it together. But because of that something, it would be nearly a total of 40 years before the people of Israel would be allowed to go into the land that God wanted them to go into. And I suggest that we think about, are there times, and how long does it take for us to do what God may be calling us to do? You've got a touch from God, a call from God, and you put it off, and you put it off, and you put it off. And so what Moses is wanting to do in the book of Deuteronomy is to give the people he's talking to some insight as to why they had to dink around in the wilderness for 40 years and end up burying their moms and dads. Think about this. Think about it with your own mom and dad. You're going to have to just dink around in some useless, non-advancing, existing, until your mom and dad die. You know? It talks about why mom and dad could not go into the promised land as they'd been promised. So Moses gets them all out on the plain of Moab, east of the Dead Sea, and gives them this sermon. And in this part 2 of this chapter, verses 6 through 46, he talks about what happened from that place, from Mount Horeb, from Mount Sinai, up to Kadesh Barnea. Something happened that caused them not to be able to enter the promised land, but rather to have to wander in the desert. It's called the wilderness. I don't know about you, my experience has been in the tropics in Peru and in Panama. So when I think of wilderness, I think of jungle, which is not the correct reference. It's this horrible looking stuff. Dry sand, at best sagebrush kind of thing, small greenery. And so they have to be out there for a generation. And verse 6 tells us that Moses said that God personally spoke to the Israelites, and he gave them 2 clear commandments in verses 7 and 8. And let's look at those. So he says, break camp and advance into the hill country of the Amorites. Go to all the neighboring peoples in the Aqaba. in the mountains, in the western foothills, in the Nev, and along the coast, into the Canaanites, and to Lebanon, as far as the great river Euphrates. See, I have given you this land. Now, in other words, he says to them, it's time to get up. You know, let's pull up stakes, and as you go, we're going to see all kinds of land. And he says, once you get to the hill country of the Amorites, and then up and beyond that to the north, all the way up to the river Euphrates in the far north, it's all yours. I'm giving it to you. I'm just going to give it all to you. So break camp, pack up the gear, saddle up the camels, and get rolling. That's the first commandment. As Nike would say, just do it. Okay? Just do it. I don't think God used that word. He probably said that in Aramaic. But anyway, the second commandment is this. It says, go in there and take it. Look at verse 8. See, I have given you this land. Go in and take possession of the land that the Lord swore he would give to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and Jacob, and to their descendants after them. Now, I don't know about you, as you've heard these stories over your life, many of you, some you've not looked at it very deeply, but when you read that, maybe you say to yourself, maybe, how fair is this? Here's this horde coming up, the Israelites, 2 million, some say 3 million, and this horde comes in, and they're just going to come in and take over the land. There's people living there. They got their houses and their families and their animals. They're all living there. It's like you and I and let's say this church of 300, we're going to go down to Appomattox and say, this is our town. Get out of here. Don't you ever think about that? Does that seem fair? How fair is that, you know? A big wandering tribe of dispossessed sojourners just want to come up and just want to sashay into somebody else's land and take it over. Well, I think there are a couple of things. I think we need to take a minute to look at it, because this is the kind of question you'll get from many unbelievers. You say, well, that's a bloody God, bloody warfare kind of thing. That's not fair, that's not right, and if that's the kind of God you love, then, you know, or does that ever get questioned to you? Certainly gets questioned to me as I go out and talk to people. Well, I think there are a couple of things we need to keep in mind. Number one, the Canaanites were some of the filthiest, most ungodly, wicked people to ever infest the earth. The Amorites and the Canaanites were particularly cruel and disgusting. They sacrificed their kids. They burnt their kids on fiery altars and sacrificed to God. They indulged in every form, so history tells us,